My name is Christy Orr. I am the Director of Disability Resources, and I am here with Justin Romack, who is Assistant Director, who has taken the lead on the Flex plans, and then Lauren McGuire, who is an Access Coordinator here, who is also working with him on Flex plans. As we mentioned, we are recording this session, and so if you need to drop out for some reason, you are welcome to listen to it later. Justin will send the link to the recording, and then we'll also be sending it to other faculty members who signed up who wanted the information but were not able to be here with us today. So we really appreciate you all being here. Absence accommodations and absences in general, even not as an accommodation, but just for the general population of students, has been challenging for faculty members, we know, for all instructors. And so it's really important to make sure that we are providing information about how we're handling absences as an accommodation. We did a similar webinar, facilitated discussion type thing right before the fall semester. And I think it was really helpful for us to be able to hear from faculty, for faculty to better understand how to manage this accommodation. Um, we looks like everybody's microphone is muted, but we do ask that you keep your microphone muted during this session. We want to make sure we get through everything. We hope and think we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So feel free to put a question in the chat if you feel like you don't want to wait till the end. I'm going to be monitoring the chat, but then we definitely will have time for questions, discussions, examples, anything that you want to share at the end. So I am going to turn it over, I believe, to Lauren to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. For those of you who've been working with disability resources for a while, I am probably new to you as I am one of the newer access coordinators. I primarily work with the students in the School of Public Health and then in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. So today, to kick it off, we wanted to talk about what are the disability-related reasons that a student may miss class. And if you want to jump in and throw some ideas in the chat, these are, when you think of why
Sorry,
absences,
you
why,
sound really
oh,
muffled. I don't know what's going on.
Is anyone else having that issue? I can hear Lauren fine. Can maybe a thumbs up if you hear her
Yeah, I
fine?
can hear, but real muffled.
it's muffled. Okay.
I,
I'm not sure.
I think everybody else can hear fine, so I don't know if it'll work just to turn your sound up, maybe. You're good, Lauren.
Okay. Okay. So what we wanted to start with is just kind of throwing some ideas out there. What are the particular disabilities that you may think of when it comes to absence situations? So if anybody wants to throw some ideas in the chat, things that I think of or things that come to mind for me, these are going to be those chronic medical conditions typically that are episodic, unpredictable, oftentimes not visible. So we're looking at things like migraines, epilepsy, diabetes, gastrointestinal. So see someone mention the chronic illnesses. That is typically what we're looking at when we're thinking about accommodations around attendance. So we'll get into the specifics of that. So as far as getting any type of accommodation, there is a process that all students do have to go through as part of determining which accommodations will be appropriate for them. So the first thing any student would have to do is to submit an application on our website. And in submitting that application, they do have to include documentation. So we have guidelines on our website as to what it is we're looking for. This does have to be documentation from an appropriate medical provider. Then what happens is they're assigned to an access coordinator. We are working on a college model, so each of us is assigned to a different college that we work with. And then the student comes, we have a 1-hour meeting. So we're sitting down. This is a very interactive process that we're having with our students. So when determining the accommodations, we're looking at both the documentation from the medical provider as well as the self-report from the student. And then Justin, if you want to go ahead, there we go. So in determining those accommodations, if there is a need around modified attendance, we typically are looking at what we call plan for absences and missed deadlines. And so we're looking at what is reasonable when we're looking at disability related absences. And the flexibility is actually determined for the class itself, not the individual student. So we're looking at what is the modality? Is this a lecture-based course? Is this a group-based course? So there's a lot of different pieces of the conversation that we're having with a student, depending on what types of classes they're taking. Now, in the plan for absences and missed deadlines, and of course now we have the flex plan, which is more recent, there were default parameters established. There was a faculty working group back in the summer of 24 where there was a collaborative conversation about what is appropriate, looking across all types of courses, all colleges, what would be appropriate default parameters. And then now, when you're seeing those flex plans and filling those out, you will continue to see those default parameters, but now we've added this new component to make it a more collaborative process.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, because that tees up the rest of this so well. I mean, I've seen so many iterations of how we handle, how we support disability related absences through an accommodation during my time here. What I really love about where we're at with this accommodation, but with so much of the work that we do, we're really we're using data and discussion to inform how we're working through this, right? As we're framing up the language, we're promoting equal access. We're making sure that there's some scaffolding to understand what that looks like in the class. And so it was really important as we met with that faculty working group, what were some of the pain points that instructors were navigating when they saw this accommodation from students? And so some of the data that helped those discussions just ahead of the summer semester in 2024, we did do a faculty survey. I won't spend too much time on this, but we surveyed any instructor who had a student with plan for absences in the spring of 2024. And we got 211 responses. The response rate was actually pretty great. I want to say it was 17-18% response rate. And then we'll cover some of that data here in just a second, but it really helped shape how we framed up that accommodation language. Fast forward to the fall of 2025, and our accommodation system integrated a new tool that would support some of that communication. So we'll talk about that. What does this accommodation look like in the scope of students here affiliated with our office? I really like numbers because I think they tell a story about the progression of this accommodation. Fall of 2021 to last semester, our population of students grew 58.8%, right? And we worked with almost 6,500 students last fall. So there was a big growth in those 4 years.
So this is a statistical anomaly. Is there anybody looking into why that is? I mean, that's just certainly not natural, right?
Well, I think that there's probably we saw a lot of growth fall of 2021. And I think we had this big spike in a way that I had not seen with our data before. COVID had an impact. I think the availability of care is very different. I think we talk culturally about disability and difference in different ways now. And so I think awareness is greater than it has been. I always like to sort of scaffold it in what the literature says. And, our population of students as it relates to the TAMU population is right around 8% of the total population at Texas A&M University. Literature would say that that percentage is probably closer to 12 or 14, if not upwards of 20 to 25, right? So World Health Organization would say 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 have a disability. Obviously, 8% is not that. And so it is interesting to see our numbers actually be a little lower than what you might expect here on campus.
And Justin, I would also share not as large of an impact, but in our department in particular, we also started serving the Galveston students directly. So that was a few hundred students as well as the dentistry students. So we do see that we have, as the university has added new programs, new ways of doing the work, we end up finding out about these different programs, some of the engineering academies, some of those things. So there is not a large number, but that has, in some ways influenced how many students that we
Is it
work
only
with.
university doctors that determine disability or any doctor?
Yeah, well, we can talk a little bit more about that after we get through the flex plan part. I think that
Okay.
that's a little bit separate
Yeah,
than just the
yeah.
flex
Okay.
plans.
Yeah, the
So
60% is astonishing. I'm a statistician, just letting you.
I appreciate your background, and it's astonishing to us too, right? The workload is definitely higher. When we say there are more students, there are more students, right? And we're all feeling that in our own individual ways. So, when I look at this accommodation, I think about in fall of 2021 how of the students that we worked with, right, 16.4% had the accommodation. That number is actually going down, right? As it relates to the total population of
I
students
see.
affiliated with our office.
I
And I
see.
think that's really important to note because one thing that I feel like could be a challenge is saying there are so many more students with this accommodation. And statistically, there aren't. There are actually fewer. And a lot of that goes into the ways we're approaching that accommodation, how eligibility, how we discuss that, the scenarios, the way we framed up the utility or the usage of the accommodation. So I think that this is a really important data point to consider. So, what is flex plan? I want to draw a distinction here. Plan for absences is the accommodation. Flex plan is the tool that we use to support that accommodation. Um, Flex plan is a communication tool that identifies default policies, expectations of your course, the activities that you engage with to support learning. It allows us to document that and have clear expectations, instructor, student, our office, so that it's on paper and on purpose. It aids necessary processes for Student Rule 7.2.1.4. So essentially, Student Rule 7 within the rule talks about disability accommodation being a support for an excused absence. So that specific subsection points that out. It talks about ADA notification or ADA accommodation related to attendance. And so this is the vehicle that supports that piece of the student rule. It provides notification to the instructor and to our staff when a student needs to use the accommodation. And then it makes expectations clear from the get-go. I think that all too often, and data showed that, there just wasn't clear communication. The expectation management of this process and this accommodation had been challenging. And so when we surveyed faculty in the end of spring of 2024, 37% of instructors that were surveyed said that they had had challenges. And a lot of times, communication, clear expectations were the problem. Proactive communication, proactive expectation management really makes this accommodation work most effectively. When I'm coaching a student, Lauren, and I know you do this too, communication is the glue, right? We are telling students any student who desires an excused absence at Texas A&M University needs to clearly communicate. And so that has been the challenge, I think, for any student, but it is a particular challenge when you are trying to accommodate attendance. The most important thing here on this slide, I'll point out as this last bullet point. The Office of Civil Rights really does place importance on students not negotiating the terms of their own accommodations. That doesn't negate self-advocacy. That doesn't negate a responsibility to communicate when a student needs something or when something isn't working out, because we don't know unless you tell us. But what it does mean is that when we start trying to finesse what an attendance accommodation can look like, OCR would say that there is a power imbalance between student and instructor, whether that's perceived or actual. That is a concern. And so being able to facilitate this discussion at the very beginning of the semester or as soon as the instructor is notified of the accommodation allows us to begin setting those parameters, figuring out what can be possible in the class. As we go along, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the questions that the plan talks through. So let me explain the process of how FlexPlan works sort of at a high level overview. So, this does not state that first step, which student has to be approved for the plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation, right? And they have to request that accommodation. So just having the accommodation isn't enough. They have to go into our system at the beginning of the semester, whenever that accommodation is approved, request it so that the formal process of notifying their instructor happens, right? So student requests the accommodation, you receive the accommodation notification letter that comes through our AIM accommodations portal. And then that triggers the availability of Flex Plan for your course. Okay. And so you'll get a notification specific to Flex Plan. There's a sequence that sort of kicks out those emails after a couple of days and it says, hey, there is a Flex Plan available for you to complete in one of your courses. You'll complete that Flex Plan questionnaire that will kind of walk you through what are some of the guidelines, what are some of the parameters when we think about flexibility, when we think about how you manage excused absences in your class, what are some of those considerations? Disability resources will review that at every step of the way. You have our support, right? Whether that's you have a question, you're wanting to make sure that this makes sense. Maybe we see something and we could advocate in a different way. There's clear communication between you and our office. You're initiating that, and then we're following it up with a review on this side. Last semester, I don't know, I think maybe I do have a slide on this later, but last semester we had 13, no, it was 1,100, almost 1,200 plans that were reviewed. We were reviewing each and every one of those, right? And it is a consultative process. And a lot of it, too, I think, is mostly just saying, how would you handle excused absences with any other student in your class? When that is approved by our office, you and your student have a copy of that flex plan, right? It's documented. Everyone is in the loop, in the know about what the expectations are. Much like any student who might miss a class for an excused absence, the student will log on to their flex plan dashboard when they need to use that accommodation so that it notifies you, hey, I was out of class. I'm requesting that this is an excused absence through my accommodation. Here are some notes based on maybe what I missed. You know, so say it's I know that I missed a quiz in the class, right? So they're going to specify I missed quiz 3 on this class in this class. And then that clearly goes to you. We've got transparency about when the accommodation is being used. And then if you have a concern, if our office notices a pattern, right, we have a concern, it allows us to have a checkpoint there to say, hey, wait a minute, I have a question about this. So you will get a notification, you can approve it, or you can dispute it if you have questions. And the best part about that dispute process is if you've got a question or a concern about how the accommodation is being used or about the flexibility that's being requested, ask that question because we see it first. We can engage with you, maybe answer that question or clarify any concern that you have, and then you can progress forward with how you would handle that in a situation with your student. There is a history that's sort of logged as this is used throughout the semester. And I'll tell you, kind of going back to the dispute process, there are situations where maybe a student didn't notify with you know a nice time frame, right? So maybe it was several days after the absence, or maybe they're requesting something that's outside of the parameters. You know, maybe it is it's something that is not easily made up, right? And so I think that is an appropriate checkpoint to say, hey, I have questions about this. What do we do with this situation? Or I don't know if I can support this. That allows us to engage in discussion, you know, in the moment rather than, hey, we're at week 15, week 16. I've got to submit grades tomorrow, and the student has concerns about this 0 that they have. I will draw parallels
So
to student. Oh,
one
go ahead,
flex
please.
plan per class, correct? Not per student, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you,
So
sir.
yeah, absolutely. So when you fill out the flex plan, and I think I have a slide next that talks about the questionnaire. When you fill out the flex plan, it is really important that you're thinking about what is flexibility for the course, not necessarily based on the student needs, right? So if I have a student with chronic migraines, the flexibility that I can support that student with is the same flexibility that I would support a student with epilepsy, right?
Hey, Justin, can I ask a quick question? One of
Please.
the things that I run into, and I teach large instructor based courses where it's, 300 to 1 ratio. And
Hmm.
things that I have had the biggest issue with is students always wanting the extension. Is it fine if instead we allow students to request time earlier, particularly to open online assignments where if I'm giving 72 plus hours for an assignment that's 30 minutes, that's already trying to be convenient, but keys need to be released to everybody to keep the students moving forward. Can the plan instead allow, if you want more time and you're worried about an episode and you think an assignment open for 4 days online where you can take it anywhere at your convenience isn't enough, would it then be possible to say the student could request that the assignment open earlier so that
I,
they constantly fall behind and have separate assignments from the rest of their peers?
yeah, I appreciate what you're saying because, right, this is all about timeline, right? And when we're asking for an assignment extension, we're asking to extend that timeline. And to me, finding ways to meet the deadline, I think is important because, right, when you ask for an extension, things snowball. That is the challenge with assignment extensions.
100%. And
And
I think a lot of students, especially when they're new to using it, because you are right, we're getting more
yeah,
students learning this, they don't initially see that.
right.
But we're at a point in the semester that it's really hard. It's snowballing.
Well, and I think you in it, because online asynchronous class, you're in a position where you can release content and assessments and activities at a very different rate than an in-person class might. I think that's a completely reasonable suggestion. Now, the only concern I might have with that, if I were to read that on a plan, is do they have access to the content that supports that activity at the same rate and pace as well, right? So if we're opening it up an extra 3 days early, but they don't have the lecture material that supports that activity or the ability to complete that assignment successfully, that would be my only concern. But I think expanding the timeline on the front end could be a reasonable suggestion.
So like posting videos ahead of time, lecture notes, study notes, if we open those, I try to open them all for an exam.
Yeah, yeah.
That would meet that justification.
I think so too, and that tends to be what I see with a lot of online classes, right? Is folks are kind of opening, and it is self-paced, right? And when we talk about flexibility, we're not asking for more flexibility. We're just asking for flexibility that we would extend to any student. And I think that's a really reasonable, flexible way to look at it. If flexibility is already inherent to the environment or the activity, then an accommodation may be less applicable, right? And so this accommodation, as it's written with a default parameter of possibly a short-term extension of 48 hours, may be less relevant when you've extended the timeline on the front side.
Yes. And I actually teach an in-person class. I just use
Oh,
this
gotcha.
a
Okay.
lot. And a lot of students, can have issues from missing. I think there's a lot of
Yeah,
arguments made that applying ADA the ADA accommodations can benefit everybody, but
I
particularly
agree.
extension, because I think your snowball comment really sums up what I see in my 400 level biochem class is that they're
Hmm.
just falling behind, trying to
Well,
always extensions.
and
I
I would
see.
advocate what you're suggesting is really universal design for learning, right? Like we are taking a universal design approach by making these available self-paced. Do I want a student to knock out an entire 16-week course in a weekend? Not probable, not ideal. I don't think they're going to do it, but I do think it allows whatever the rationale or reason may be, it allows them to find a way to get that content at a pace, a rate, and a space that allows them to be most comfortable. And that facilitates good learning, right?
Hmm. So to summarize, is a very important point. So if we put it in the front instead of after the deadline, it seems like we can release keys so the other students don't get affected. And one part that's confusing, do they need to request access per assignment, or like how can we make sure that we put the extra time in the front?
hmm
Yeah.
so here's where I don't know enough about the LMS to tell you that, and I'd love to find an answer because if that's a strategy that helps support students, I think that's worthwhile to look at. Because I understand the key, the releasing the answer key. For me, I would say, okay, if we're going to say that that's an okay practice, let's just do it globally. And then again, when you get to that question, I think it's question 5 that talks about assignment extensions that are related to absences. Maybe the answer is I open my assignments well in advance of the deadline. They're open before, these are
Okay.
open to all students for an extended period of time, right?
Okay.
And then that makes that piece of the accommodation less relevant and applicable because you've already promoted flexibility with the design of the timeline.
And,
Is
and
time
oh,
1 week? Because I feel like For
So
me,
let me interrupt for just a second. Sorry, Michelle. I think one thing we have to be careful of in these big groups is that part of what makes our job really challenging is that we always say the answer is it depends.
Hmm.
So I'm very cautious of people hearing in a session like this,
Sure.
the answer to all your concerns is just open it 1 week ahead of time
Right.
and then you're good to go.
Right.
So that may be the answer for your class, but that is not a universal answer.
Right.
So some of the questions, when we get too much in the nitty gritty, that probably needs to be some follow up outside of this session where you can talk to Justin or Lauren or the access coordinator assigned to your college about your course. What are the requirements for it? What are you trying to achieve? It really is important to look at your course and what makes sense for that. So I'm kind of saying let's stop this conversation, and especially because we want to get through the details of the
Yes.
flex plan. We are happy to have individual conversations with you about this and try to really look in depth about your class or your classes and what would make sense for that. We
Kind
do
of.
have one hand raised. If we
Yeah.
can answer kind of quickly so we can keep moving through this. Dr.
Uh,
Yang?
I have a question. So if my quiz assignment, they are just bonus points.
Hmm.
They are not part of the regular points. So should I accommodate the same plan for those?
Kind of pointing back to Christy's point, I think it really depends on how bonus points are, what the activity is, what the availability of that activity is, the timeline of its availability, how you handle that with other students who have excused absences, right? Any other excused absence type. And when I see bonus points sort of mentioned in some of these flex plans, that tends to be a lot of the follow-up questions that I have. So the good thing is about flex plan is you're going to suggest parameters, or you're going to put parameters in that plan. And if something seems unclear, I can always follow up, or we can always follow up and say, hey, you mentioned this. I have a question about how you do that in the class. Because ultimately, we want to land in the right spot where the accommodation is facilitated well, and fits with how you would support any other student with any other excused absence rationale. And I think that's a good segue to this slide
I'm sorry,
because,
one more really
yeah,
short.
sure,
I'm really
sure.
sorry, but pertains to everybody. If we want to do this whole front load strategy, all I need to do as instructor is really spell it out clearly in the flex plan. Is that correct? Or is there a situation where the student might not see it because they need to do a second step or something like that? Can you
Well,
explain how we can relay that information to all the
for
disability
sure.
students? Thank you.
For sure. I mean, I think communication is everything, and that's what Flex Plan is, right? Flex Plan is communication, and for the students who will probably be impacted by this most, they get a copy of what your Flex Plan guidelines are. And if that were a strategy that through consultation with your class and your Flex Plan, we agreed, hey, this promotes reasonable flexibility, your student would get a copy of that so that they knew, number one, knew about it, and number two, would be accountable for it in using their accommodation.
So they won't be in a situation that they don't know about this front load delay, right? Correct?
If that's so, if that were the strategy that we said, hey, this promotes flexibility, then yes, that would be clearly documented in the flex plan and then
Thank you.
clearly communicated to the student.
Thank you, sir. That's it for
Yeah,
me. I
yeah.
promise.
No, you're so good. You're so good. So, connecting this to Student Rule 7, which I think is really important, I pointed out some subsections here. 7.2.1.4, that talks about disability accommodation as an excused absence. There is an expectation of timely communication, timely notification, that's 7.1.1. And then having a suitable makeup a makeup or a suitable alternative when a student experiences excused absences. These are sort of the subsections of Student Rule 7 that we've really leaned into as we've built out this accommodation. So we do have a questionnaire. Last semester, the questionnaire had an additional question. We have removed that, and I'll talk about some other changes for this semester. But there are 7 questions. And you access this questionnaire through your AIM instructor portal. And the questions really get at how many absences, how many excused absences can a student have in your class before that impacts their ability to be successful, right, in the class? Successfully meet the learning objectives and outcomes of your class, okay? It asks questions about participation. How do you support students with excused absences when there are participation points or activities in your class? What about your makeup policy for exams and quizzes? Another question talks about short-term assignment deadlines. If you have a short-term assignment and students are submitting things that, and I define short-term assignment in the question, 5 calendar days or less. How might you handle that if you have a student with an excused absence? There's a question about lab activities. Do you have a lab that's associated with the course? Is it you coordinating the lab or is there a coordinator? And then there's a final question that says, hey, we've done our very best with the first 6 questions to try to measure your class and some of the common activities, but are there other things that you do in your class that aren't encompassed in these questions that might be impacted by attendance? No, yes. With the yes, we ask, what are those activities? Could they be presentations, group work, peer review, other types of activities? And then that's an opportunity to say, hey, I do this, this, and this in my class, and here's how I would typically work through that situation if I had a student with an excused absence. That questionnaire is submitted, routed to our office, we review it, and then you'll get comments or a notice that it's been completed once it's been reviewed. I dropped a new screenshot in here this morning because I was really excited about this. So one of the challenges I think we had with FlexPlan last semester is that you couldn't begin working on a FlexPlan until a student requested the accommodation. And I think that's challenging because you're on the spot in the moment. And so AIM is our accommodation system, released a feature where you can have advanced submission of your flex plan. So the classes where you have students with accommodations, they will appear in a queue where you can load a flex plan for those classes, whether or not a student has requested them. And the coolest part about it all is you can get that submitted and then you submit one. And if you want to copy it to other classes, you could fill out just one plan and conceivably copy it across if your classes are designed in a very similar way. And so this example, there were 10 plans available for this instructor. And this instructor, if their classes were designed very similarly, could actually copy that to all 10 classes from one submission. And so I think that's really, really cool. There is a notification piece for students. They have a questionnaire. We changed this a little bit this semester based on the fact that we just weren't getting good data when students submitted a notification. It wasn't always clear what they were requesting. The other challenge is that they could submit multiple days of absences on one request. And so we changed that. And then there's some acknowledgement statements. Students will acknowledge that this is related to the disability for which they have the accommodation. It isn't an illness. It isn't a doctor's appointment. It isn't some other university excused absence. It isn't, hey, I didn't want to go to class. You are acknowledging this is related to my disability. Secondarily, there's another confirmation statement that talks about communicating with instructors. The other challenge I think we ran into in the fall was that students would submit this, and that was the period at the end of the sentence. And the reality is, it's more like a comma, right? They need to reach out to their instructor, much like you would have a student that maybe it has the flu, right? They're going to submit a doctor's note and they're going to say, hey, professor, I was out of class. What do I need to do to get caught up? What did I miss? Right? Or, hey, I was late on this assignment. How do we figure that out? What is the new deadline? And that communication piece is critical. And so they will acknowledge, hey, I know I'm submitting the notification, but I'm also going to reach out to my instructor.
Justin, we had a quick question. Can you copy plans over from the past semesters of the same course?
Yeah, so about that. Yes, you can, but we changed the questionnaire. So it is not an apples to apples questionnaire from last semester. Now, you can still get to your plan from last semester. So you can still see what those responses are if you want to sort of jog your memory, but it does have to be re-entered into this new format.
Our hope is that we will settle on a questionnaire and you will be able to do that. But
Yes.
as we've just, rolled this out, we're really trying to get it where it's as easy as possible for faculty members and we get good information. So that's why we made the changes that we made over the break.
Absolutely. I feel really good about the changes, and I feel we're in a good landing spot. Want to do some assessment to make sure that it's truly meeting needs, but I feel really good about this set of questions. And truthfully, I feel like the categories of questions are good. What does the additional comment stand for? Um, Christy, tell me that question. We can tackle that right now.
Yeah, so it's talking about question 5. I don't know, do you want to talk through the changes first and then go into
Let
the
me,
specific
yeah,
question?
let me do that. Let me talk through the changes, and then I'm going to pull up the questionnaire and we'll talk through it. But changes for spring 2026, what we did, and it kind of relates to your question actually, we did provide more options and better scaffolding for some of these choices. We use words, and we use terms in this questionnaire that may not be the same way that you would explain it. And so, kind of giving some of that scaffolded, like this is what we meant when we were asking this question, I think has already led to some better data, some better feedback from instructors. We are requesting more information from students, and I think that's going to help you as an instructor understand what is the student asking me. Like, I'm happy to support the student. I just need to know what they want or need. And then we don't submit those multi-day absences. I think it was born out of a desire to be helpful to everybody, but it was unclear when a student would submit a multi-day absence, maybe what day this particular activity fit in the timeline. And so it's really important that we know, hey, I'm requesting this on this day. The specificity, I think, is helpful. So let me do this. I have this slide here that talks about the questionnaire. I'm going to pull up a copy of the questionnaire so that I can refer to it. Um, Categorically, the questionnaire didn't change very much. A lot of what was on the questionnaire last fall is still there, right? We're talking about your attendance and absence policy, right? We are talking about makeup quizzes and exams and assignment deadlines. We're kind of getting it at it in a slightly different way. So I've got my questionnaire up. And there are 7 questions on the questionnaire. And
Justin, it put a little black box over your
oh,
questionnaire on
probably
the slides.
probably because I have another window open. Here, let me see. I'm going to share a different screen here. Hold on just one second. I didn't know that it would do that, so that's not helpful. Can you see my Word document here?
Yes.
Good deal. So these are the questionnaires with some
But
tracked
wait,
changes.
Justin, but we're under, okay, yeah, maybe where it says general changes, remove question 1. Is that what you want us to see?
Yes.
Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Okay, question 1. Got it.
Yep. Okay. So these are the questions on the questionnaire. How many excused absences may be provided through this accommodation without impacting the student's ability to successfully meet objectives and learning outcomes for this course, right? And so the thing that you have to understand philosophically about this accommodation is what are we supporting through the accommodation in terms of excused absences? And so one thing that I will see that is really common, so the default language is double what you have in the syllabus. Some instructors don't have anything in the syllabus, and so we're kind of trying to come up with a number that's a good rule of thumb for that course. Some instructors will say, well, I allow 2 absences, double that would be 4. And so what we're supporting through the accommodation is not 4 additional, it is 2 additional, right? It is the doubled portion of whatever you're providing. We've provided some additional options here. So, you could use the default language that's in the accommodation that says double. You could specify a number. You could specify a percentage, right? I will support up to 20% because there's a standard, TLAC does this a lot, right? So based on TEA guidelines for certification for teachers, they've got to be there. They can't miss more than 20%, right? And so we can put a percentage there. We did add an option that talks about limited flexibility because it will adversely impact the way students engage in the class. When I say limited, that's 10% or less in absences. And so there's an opportunity to specify why is that? What activities will be impacted? And then you could say, I don't take attendance, right? Attendance doesn't matter, and so it's not relevant to this particular question. So question 2, I apologize. I don't have a clean version of this. I just have my internal track document. So what plan should be followed for missed participation points when a student has an excused absence through this accommodation? And so you've got some options. Pedagogically, participation activities, we use them for different reasons. And so maybe these options don't make sense to you or make sense for your situation. And you can always specify, I will use this plan, right? And then that gives you an opportunity. Here's how I would handle it with any other student who has an excused absence. Similar for exams, right? So we talk about, how are you handling makeup exams? A lot of instructors want to get it done within a week, and you can specify that right here uh, on this plan. Q4 is about quizzes, and then we have Q5, question 5. And so I was going to come to this one real quick. What plan should be followed if a student misses a short-term assignment deadline due to an excused absence through this accommodation? And then I put tip, short-term assignments are typically defined by 5 or fewer calendar days to complete. And so some of the options here, I think question 5 was brought up just a minute ago. Short-term outside of class assignments can be submitted within 48 hours of the original due date. I don't know I don't know why that one on the questionnaire is asking for an additional comment because that's the default option. I probably need to take a look at that. There are some other options here, right? So maybe you already provide details on flexible deadlines, right? I've seen a number of instructors say, I give students 5 days and then there are 2 additional days after that are just sort of freebies. Like I'm not going to penalize you if you submit it within that timeline. And so that would be a spot you could specify that here. Maybe you don't have outside of class assignments, or maybe your class uses just long-term assignments, right? You have a week, couple weeks, a month, a semester, right? Semester long project. And those may not apply here. And there's an option here to specify that. And then question 6 talks about labs. I won't camp out on that. And then question 7 talks about are there other activities that were not covered in this plan that you feel like excused absences would impact. And so that gives you kind of an overview of the questionnaire. And what I would say too, and I was going to share this with you all as a follow-up. I'll give you a clean copy of the questionnaire if you wanted to draft it in a Word document so it's easy to just kind of copy and paste. But this is a resource that could be easily available to folks if they wanted to fill it out ahead of time. I'm going to share my PowerPoint again real quick. And I think that's a lot of what we had planned ahead of time.
So, what questions do you have based on that? And again, I know I've said this and I'm now saying it, so I put a smiley face on my answer to Lauren that it depends. So, if you're getting really in the weeds of your specific class, sorry, it's a Friday afternoon, it's hard to talk, then we might need to have a separate conversation. But if it is a question about flex plans in general or, how this works or anything like that, happy to answer. And I see that Michael Head has unmuted.
And this is kind of because last semester was the first semester, I think. at least the first semester that I was aware of it and participated in this. But I had no requests last semester. And so the slide that Justin added where and what I'm trying to translate is my interpretation last time and going into this is if the students in my classes that are eligible for disability resource accommodations, if none of them request a flex plan, I don't have a flex plan to do, is my understanding.
So the accommodation would be planned for absences and missed deadlines, right? So if they request that accommodation, AIM instructor portal will automatically send you a notification to complete a flex plan. This flex plan is that was one confusion that we saw in the fall. Flex plan is not for all accommodations, right? It's just for that one very specific accommodation. So what it sounds like is you didn't have a student in your classes who requested plan for absences and missed deadlines, which is why you were not prompted to fill out a flex plan.
Right. I think that's a more accurate way to say it. You get your letter from you guys that's saying this student is in your class, is eligible for accommodations. And then there's the section that has 1.5 times,
Right.
and they'll bullet it out. And for the flex plan accommodation to impact me, it's got to be listed in that bullet out list.
That's right. And that bullet would read plan for absences and missed
Gotcha.
deadlines. Yep.
Okay.
You're totally right. And you know what? Let me full transparency, because I think that's a really good point. The reason you got an invitation to this event is because you do have a student who is registered for your class with that accommodation. That is the report I ran out of AIM. There were 1,187 instructors who at the beginning of the semester had a student with plan for absences and missed deadlines. Will all 1,187 of those instructors have to fill out a flex plan? Maybe not, right? Because students don't request that accommodation. But we wanted to equip you with information ahead of that request in the event that they do.
Okay, so you maybe confused me a little bit.
Fair enough.
There's a difference between they're eligible for it and they ask for it in their accommodation letter.
That is correct.
Because I've gotten, at least I think I've gotten all my accommodation letters. Sometimes they come in a little bit later.
They do.
But all of the letters I've gotten so far has not listed a accommodation flex plan for absences, but I'm on the invite because someone could have
yes.
or could in the future ask for it.
That's right. And that's why I shared that one slide about the advance submission, because it might not be a bad idea. You know, if it's not this semester, it could be next semester too. You could fill out a plan, and then as soon as that student requests it, boom, it's done, right? It's already ready to go. It's one less thing to have to do. In my follow-up email to this event, I will definitely share a tutorial on how to get to that advanced submission, because I don't think that's a bad idea if you've got the bandwidth, the time to do that right now, right? Because it's more likely for you that you will have a student request it because you do have a student who's eligible for it.
And Justin, I think that answers my question, but I just want to make sure. So I just filled out my questionnaire, but the student has not initiated it. So it's okay to fill it out, submit it, and then you all look at it. And if the student needs it, they need it.
Yeah, so I'm curious because I just learned about this advanced submission today. You're seeing the status that said not initiated, student not initiated as well?
Right.
Yeah, you did it exactly right. That's correct. So
Okay.
the way it should work is when the student requests the accommodation, because you already would have a flex plan that's been reviewed and approved, it would just automatically apply that to the student.
Yes.
All the work's done up front.
Thank you.
Justin, we do have a question about how long it will take for the flex plan written by the instructor to get approved. And I will say just one little kudos to Justin. which he won't like because he doesn't like to take credit for anything. But in the fall semester, he reviewed every single one of those 1,200 or 1,300 or whatever it was flex plans because we wanted to have consistency. We wanted to figure this out. So that was on top of all the other jobs that he was doing. So I think he was pretty fast, but I'm not sure what you're thinking now, Justin, about how long it's taking you to get through those. And we'll be changing that process as we move forward. It's just new to all of us, and we're trying to make sure that we are really learning from this.
Thank you. And any flex plan that's been submitted to this point today will be approved by the end of this week. So I'm trying to get them done within 2 business days. The challenge is when you get 150 that come in all at once, it's hard to keep to that. But 2 business days is really what I'm shooting for right now. And if you've submitted one and you're like, it's been more than 2 business days, I will have it done this week, I promise.
So can you clarify once more what's the difference between a flex plan that nobody has requested
Mhm.
versus the flex plan that people have requested? Kind of got confused there.
Yeah,
What?
you can tell the things I've talked about a lot and the things I haven't talked about a lot. This is the one I haven't talked about a lot. So there is a status that you will see associated with your flex plan. And because flex plans are initiated by the instructor, meaning you create the first draft of the plan, if you see not initiated by student, I think it says not initiated, comma, not initiated by student, that means you're filling it out in advance, right? It means I haven't had a
Okay.
student request it, but I'm filling it out ahead of when they
It's
do.
not a different tab or different button. We do the exact same thing, correct?
It is a different tab. It is on the same page, the same Flex Plan dashboard. It just has a link that says Flex Plan. I think it says Flex Plans to complete without accommodation or without request. And so
Okay,
it's
so
a,
the
and it'll
tool,
show
the
you a
tool, the
yes.
tool does this distinction for us.
That
We
is
don't
correct.
manually do it. Thank you,
That
sir.
is correct. Yes.
And let me
I
give a big picture perspective. So even outside of flex plans, when a student is approved for accommodations, they have the meeting, they're approved for accommodations, those go into AIM, which is the system that we use. And then the student has to go in and request their letters to go to their instructor. So they go in and check a box in AIM that says, I want these letters sent. And then we have to go in and approve them being sent out. So there's a couple of steps there. And if it's a student that's a returning student, they may not be thinking about it immediately, although we are sending email reminders. So it may be that the student has been approved last semester and now we're in the first week of school and they haven't thought to go in and have their letters sent yet. So kind of big picture, that's how all the accommodations work is the students do have to request their letters each semester and they have to check a box saying which professors they want those letters to go to because they might decide they don't want an accommodation one semester or they don't want a particular professor to get that accommodate or that letter and that's they have the autonomy to do that.
Thank you. Do you guys collect information about the number of students that are going to rely on screen readers? And the reason I bring that up is that we have digital accessibility that we need to meet. But to be honest, you can meet it by putting a one-word description for figure and almost no description for equations. Do you guys actually collect the information of how many students are going to rely on the screen reader? So we need to like make sure the screen reader description is adequate rather than just passing a score on Canvas.
I
yeah,
can, I'll say, Justin,
please, yeah.
yeah, so we do have that information. We are not necessarily
Mhm.
sharing it with anyone because it's a federal regulation for things to be accessible. And you're right, there are ways to get around it. But the problem is, if you have done that in your class and then a student comes in next year or in the middle of a semester something happens and your class is not accessible, you're going to have to do a whole lot of remediation really quickly. So,
No,
you
let me
know,
rephrase. We will make everything 100% accessible,
sure,
but it's very easy to meet the accessibility. You could put a one-word description for a figure and it
sure.
passes. My question is,
Mhm.
how do I know how many students in my class are going to rely on the screen reader? This
Yeah,
is so I take this up a step further. It's not for me to circumvent anything. It's for me to, in fact, add more details like
yeah, and I'm
transcripts.
gonna I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because that's not the focus of this webinar. So it
Okay.
sounds like maybe we could have a separate
Okay.
conversation
No
about
problem.
that. But I want to make sure that we get these flex plan questions answered. And I know Larry has his hand raised. So we are happy to have a separate meeting and talk about some of those concerns if you want to do that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Larry.
So I just want to make sure I understand I think from Michelle's question earlier, if I post a homework in Canvas and I give students 48 or more hours to do it, I still can be required to make accommodations for somebody outside that open window.
Yeah, and let's talk about why that might be, right? So let's think about the types of situations where this accommodation is applicable to students. A lot of times it's for students who are experiencing disability flares. Um, here's the thing. A disability flare could be it impacts me this afternoon, or I've got cluster headaches or migraines that extend a day or 2 days. And if you've got this short-term assignment deadline, that absence then impacts the entirety of that timeline. That's why we're real specific about short-term timelines, right? Um, and so, if you've got a project or a task, I'm a PhD student. My assignments are available for 6 8 weeks, right? And 2 days of migraines are not going to impact me. So yes, in that situation it would be appropriate to say, hey, if the disability impact extends the timeline of the short-term assignment, here's how I would provide support to a student if they provided me with an excused absence.
Is
Okay.
1 week assignments that is normal for most people? Do you think that constitutes a long-term assignment or a short-term assignment?
I do think in many situations it does. I think, it depends. I know is a challenging answer, but the reality is if you had something that was sort of in that gray area, Flex Plan gives us the ability to talk about that ahead of time rather than, hey, the student's trying to tell me that they need more time in
I
the
see.
moment, and that's the worst time to try to figure that out,
So even
right?
for 1 week, you recommend having a plan for 1 week, right?
I define short-term assignments as 5 calendar days. And so that is what's specified on the plan. I have seen instructors in the comments box telling me, hey, this is kind of right at 5 days. What do you think about this? There is an option that says long-term assignments. If there were questions, it would be easy to follow up. But I think 5 days is in many situations, not all situations, right? It depends if, what if. But I think 5 days tends to be a good litmus for a lot of that.
Long term would be a long
Yes.
term. Correct. Thank you, sir.
Yes. Yeah. I think you're right. Somebody who looked at a lot of that data last year across a lot of different disciplines, 1 week does seem to be a pretty common timeline for a lot of assignments. The
The
prevail.
deadline to fill all of these?
I would say the earlier they get completed in the semester, the less nagging emails, first of all. But I'll say when it's not filled out, the student is unable to submit their notification saying that they were absent due to their disability.
Got
So it
it. Yeah.
creates an issue for the student because there's nothing for them to do their part of the
So really,
process.
first day of class is the true deadline, correct? Yeah.
I
Okay.
would say so, and I would say because now they can be submitted in advance. My
I see.
hope
I
would
see.
be that some of the communication leading into the summer and the fall would be, hey, here's how you fill this out ahead of time.
And for the exams, they take it in the disability center. Is it administered at the exact same time or no? And the reason I ask is that I want to be there for them if I can, but of course, if it's a simultaneous thing, I can't.
Well, so as it relates to Flex Plan, if you wanted to be available to your student during their makeup exam, you could specify in the Flex Plan, my plan for makeup exams would be to talk with the student so that we have a time that I know I will be available, right?
But
And
they
then
have to take it in the disability center. They must take it there,
they
correct?
don't have to take it in the
Oh, okay, okay, good
if
to
part of
know.
your plan is they could come to my office and take it, then that's fine as long as you're able to
Okay, okay,
facilitate their accommodations.
okay, okay. So they can take it anywhere. Okay, thank you.
Hmm.
Okay,
Um,
we are at time, Justin,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Let me make one last little clarifying or not clarifying comment, but just kind of encouragement. um, prevailing sort of theme of all of this is it's incredibly collaborative, right? Our office intends to be collaborative. We intend to be developmental and support faculty as much as we do students. And I really think this is a cool tool that helps foster that idea. So please know, I know this may seem new. I know it may seem like it's extra, but you're not alone. And I'm happy to help you if at any point in the process you just want to talk through some of the responses that you're using on your plan.